Thank you everyone for joining us for the last class in Laurie Novick's series, Soliciting the Other, Reading Talmud with Levinas. Laurie, thank you so much for this wonderful shiur. We all really appreciate it here at Torah in Motion. Just for everyone here, as a general note, to stay tuned for Marty Lokshin's class tomorrow morning and Shuli Mishkin's class Thursday at noon. And so, Laurie, feel free, take it away.
Okay. Thank you so much, Leah. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Leah, I'm going to ask you to just repost the source sheet in the first few minutes a couple of times, just because people, I see people still coming in and I want to make sure that everyone has access to it.
Sure.
Okay. I'm so happy to be here to kind of bring this series to an exciting close, with a really beautiful and profound Talmudic reading from Levinas. And it's really a capstone for what we've done so far. We'll talk more about kind of the overall arc of this series, Bezrat Hashem, at the end. But so far we talked about forgiveness and the role of the interpersonal and the ethical in Levinas's thought to some extent. And we began to talk about in our last class, we talked about Levinas thinking about revelation and talking about the temptation of temptation being philosophy or putting knowledge first, and the essential aspect of putting ethics from his perspective, for putting ethics or the response to the other or a call from the other preceding the search for knowledge, and that's represented in his thought by revelation and the giving of the Torah. And today we're going to open the door to talk about mitzvot. So without further ado, I want to go straight into the Mishnah. This is on your source sheet. It's line 5. And this Mishnah is talking about the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin, there's a great court of law, which is of 71. There's smaller courts of law, which are of Sanhedrin Kitana, which are of 23. How do we get these numbers? Well, if sort of like a quorum is 10, like a minyan, 10 and 10 make 20. You could have 2 quorums going in different directions, and then it gets built up. We need to have an odd number, and if we're going to make certain types of verdicts, in particular in capital crimes, we need to make sure that it's by more than just one vote that someone would be condemned. So we wind up with the number 23. So let's look at the Mishnah talking about how a Sanhedrin would be configured. Sanhedrin haita, I'm in line 5. Sanhedrin haita kechatzi goren agula. The Sanhedrin was organized when people were sitting on the Sanhedrin, when sitting in judgment within the Sanhedrin. The way it was laid out, the way the room was laid out, was as like a half circular threshing floor. Think of like almost, I think we would probably use the term horseshoe shaped to describe the kind of configuration they're talking about. And then the Mishnah says something very, very compelling. The Mishnah says that means Kidei shehu ro'in ze et ze. Why is it so significant that we have this sort of horseshoe shape to the Sanhedrin? Because that's going to enable people to, or the people on the Sanhedrin, to all see each other as well as anyone else in the room. The way that Levinas puts it is that this is the interpersonal relationship within the assembly. People are seeing each other face to face, so there's no interruption in the dialogue. A lot of times I think I don't know how much time you give thought to how a court is configured, but I think in my head, I think of a court as very hierarchical in the sense of, and very formal in the sense of, you have kind of the judge, and the judge is up there and everything else is sort of subsidiary to the judge. And here there's a panel of judges. And what Levinas is emphasizing is that these panel of judges, it's building from the Mishnah, this panel of judges are configured in a way that they all see each other. And that enables them to maintain an ongoing dialogue. In his words, it was an assembly of faces and not a joint stock company. These are real people. They're not just faces in the crowd. They're all seeing each other. And then he adds that it's a semicircle, it's an open circle. And he says that's exactly the point. The judges who are on the court are all seeing each other and as they discuss the case or when they're giving their verdict, but within that open space, they're also constantly open to the outside world. It's really a rather beautiful vision of justice, which is going to be a theme of today's reading. A vision of justice that involves primarily faces confronting faces, humans making decision as faces in dialogue with other faces, a true interpersonal relationship, where that interpersonal relationship extends, as it were, to make room for the whole world. It's not a closed circle of anonymous bots. It's real people in this open circle to the world. Okay, continuing with the lines of the Mishnah. Ushnei sofrei hadayanim omdim lifnehem. And they would have two scribes. You could think of it as the court reporter, on the transcripts, going with the shorthand. Echad miyamin v'echad mismol, one on either side of this horseshoe or semicircle. The kotvin divrei hamazachin, the divrei hamachayvin. So according to this opinion, you've got two court scribes doing the transcript, and each of them is doing a transcription of everything. And Levinas points out that the fact that you'd have two really resonates with, again, Jewish conceptions of justice or legality, which usually involve two witnesses to establish something legally. And there's another opinion, though, which is even more intriguing. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shlosha. Rabbi Yehuda says there are three. Echad kotev divrei hamazakin, echad kotev divrei hamachayvin. There's one who's going to be writing out the defense arguments, one who's going to be writing out the arguments for the prosecution, or as it were, the arguments against. Vashlishi kotev divrei hamazakin v'divrei hamachayvin. And there's a third party who's writing everything. Okay, moving forward a little bit. V'shalosh shurot shel talmidei chachamim yoshvin lifnehem. And there are 3 lines of talmidei chachamim that are sitting in front of the semicircle of the judges on the Sanhedrin. And these are students. Kol echad ve'echad mikir et mekomo. And these students are arranged in some sort of hierarchical fashion. Now here, Levinas points out that it's really remarkable that you have this role for students within this court. He says, this is something you don't usually see in a court of law. In front of the judges, I'm quoting, sit students of the law, those who study the Torah, but are not yet invested as judges. The court is indeed not a synagogue. It is a little bit of a school. Study of the law and jurisdiction, theory and practice, rigor and mercy. In Judaism, all the polarizations of the spirit belong to the duality of the house of study and the court. So I told you that one of our big themes of the day is going to be justice, and he's already speaking to justice here. Levinas is saying, notice this feature of the Sanhedrin, of how it's arrayed, that there are lines of students before it. And this is not just a minor feature, according to Levinas. According to Levinas, this speaks to the essence of a Jewish conception of judgment. The Jewish conception of judgment is not just a matter of draw line, of draw law, let me try that again, of dry law. Sorry, it took me a while to get that out. It's got a sort of duality to it. It's not just the theory, it's the practice. It's not just the rigor, it's also the mercy. It's a court, but it is always an ongoing process of learning. It's also a school. Okay, he continues. And now we are in line 10, okay? Hu tzarchu lismoch, somchin min harishona. Echad min hashniya balo larishona. Echad min hashlishi balo lashniya. So let's say that they need to invest a new person to join the court. What could be a scenario? We said before, for example, the capital cases. Now, a court of 23 can try capital cases. A Sanhedrin of 23, now capital cases, you can't decide that someone is guilty of a capital crime without at least a 2-vote majority. So what happens if we have a 1-vote majority? In that case, we might well need to bring someone in from this pool of students and invest them as a judge. So that's why we have this concept that what he's saying, that if we need to, this is the Mishnah, if we need to invest someone, we need to give someone smicha, official standing as a judge in this context. Somchin min harishona, we take someone from the front row. And then someone from the second row is going to come to the front row, and someone from the third row is going to move into the second row. Okay. And then what do you do with the empty seat, right? We took someone from the row of students. We've grown the core. We don't leave the seat empty, which is also fascinating. We find someone else who's present watching the proceedings, and we bring them into the row of students, the third row. But here's the thing, that person who's invested isn't necessarily just going into the seat that was freed up. That person is going into the spot that was fitting for them. This duality that Levinas was talking about before is really very much exemplified by the next part of the Mishnah. You see how it suggested the idea, because the lines between who is a judge, who is a student, and who is watching the proceedings, who's just a member of the, you could say almost audience, are very porous, right? Someone who is a student can become a judge. Someone who's watching the proceedings can join the row of students. And not only they're going to join the row of the students, they're going to join back to face. They're not just going to go into anonymous seat 3B, which was emptied out or vacated. They're going to go into the spot that's appropriate for them. So this all sets the stage for Levinas to the idea that when we're talking about justice, it's never just talking about some strict theoretical idea. It's always somehow rooted and in dialogue between people face to face, and also very much we're talking about a connection between law and the world. But he's going to say more, and where he really gets rolling with this Talmudic reading is when the Gemara gets started, which is here for us on our source sheet. This is line 13. The Gemara kicks off with a question that the Gemara asks all the time, Mina Hani Mili, from whence do we know these words? From whence do these words come? In other words, can you give us some backup? Where does this come from? Levinas points out in his reading that this comes up all the time. We have this kind of question all the time in relationship to the Mishnah, again and again and again in his Talmudic readings. When Levinas sees a question like this, he pauses to talk methodologically and to emphasize that to our Western minds, or to the way we've been conditioned to think, oftentimes the way that the verses are going to be used in answer to this question, the answer to the question, where does the Mishnah get this from, is usually going to be rooted in a verse. Like, can I ask you to share the source sheet just one more time? Thank you so much. The answer to where the Mishnah gets it from is almost always going to be rooted in a verse. And still, the verses often don't make sense to us in a natural or an intuitive reading as establishing that which our sages say that they establish. And Levinas is very aware of this. And again and again and again, he insists that we be aware that he thinks that there's always a deliberate interpretive move, a statement behind the choice of the Gemara to draw, or the tradition that highlights the relationship between a given verse and a law in the Mishnah, and that it's very much worthy of examination and deep thought. So in this case, there's something in particular that he's also going to be dealing with in trying, oh, thank you for correcting the link. In this case, there's also something in particular that he's going to be dealing with in trying to understand how the verse, we're actually going to see more than one verse, how the verse that's going to come up in the Gemara is really grounding the idea of the Mishnah. And that is another question, which is, well, what if the tradition doesn't just come from the verse? So Levinas is very comfortable saying that the verse is going to give us a lot to work with. It's coming from a rich interpretive tradition of generations. But is everything that we see something that's coming inherently from within our tradition? The theme of the colloquium in which he gave this particular reading was, does the world need Judaism? And it's very much what he's talking about here. So for example, one of the things that bothers him is the very word Sanhedrin is derived from a Greek word that means council. I mean, he says, isn't the Sanhedrin on some level also drawing from older traditions? What does it mean for us to be using a verse to talk about an institution that in all likelihood has also been influenced by other cultures? This is something he's been thinking about a lot. And I want to quote here what his answer is, which I think is very, very important. Whatever the historical causality and the antecedents of ideas and institutions might be, they always conceal their origin. What matters is the discovery of the convergence of the spiritual efforts of mankind, or, and this is even more likely, but does not contradict the first interpretation, what matters is to know in what spirit something is borrowed. What's Levinas saying? We've talked earlier, in particular in our first session, we talked about Levinas as having a project of quote unquote, translating the Torah into Greek, the Talmud into Greek, helping us understand the ways in which the Talmud, in his reading, is a very universal text. Here he's saying something else. He's saying that it's not just universal, but when we're looking at something that we know has been shaped by history, what's going to be particularly important is to see the unique spin, the way in which that thing has been adapted. I'm going to go out of Levinas for a moment and give you an example. I think most of us are familiar with the idea that some elements of classic Greek symposium or Roman feasts were adopted in the construction of the Pesach Seder. But I don't think any of us would say that the Pesach Seder is a Roman feast or a Greek symposium. I think we all know that to the extent that things were borrowed, they were also to some extent transmuted, transformed. Levinas is saying, in what spirit is something borrowed? Even if the idea of Sanhedrin is itself a Greek word, there are still things that are unique in the way in which that has been adapted and realized in convergence with the biblical vision of court of justice. He continues, given this, in seeking a foundation for borrowing in the letter of a past which is not its own, the borrower links what he is borrowing to a tradition and formulates, beyond similarities of structure, the meaning he is giving to what he is borrowing. Whatever the channel of history through which the Sanhedrin was established in Israel, whatever the forms of its historical existence in pre-exilic society, it's interesting to know what meaning Jewish thought and sensibility attributed to it. So he said, yeah, sure, the Greeks had courts of law. Okay, even the word Sanhedrin isn't unique to us, but there is still something that's being said here that is a message that needs to be heard that is not going to be heard elsewhere. Now, there's something else that really strikes him about the verse that we're about to see that grounds our Mishnah about the court of law. And the other thing that really strikes him is that the verses that we see, for the most part, in the text, in the Talmud that's going to follow, are verses from the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim, we understand as telling us a story about the love between God and the Jewish people. And there are a lot of different ways to read the allusions within the text as having deep and profound spiritual meaning. And at the same time, the simple reading of the text of Shir HaShirim is to some extent erotic. And Levinas wants to highlight this. He says, one may grant in exceptional cases that an erotic text can deepen to the point of reaching a mystical meaning, i.e., sure, I get it, Shir HaShirim, he says, can have a lot to it. It can have a mystical meaning. But here we are in the presence of a stranger enterprise, he says, an erotic text founding a court of law and a system of justice. Again, Levinas here is struggling with the question of what is justice? What is universal about this text? What could we have found in some other tradition? What is a special message that's here? And one of the things that he's seeing that are really drawing his attention is that the verses we're going to draw on to show the quote unquote spirit in which this was transmuted, in which the Sanhedrin is really fundamentally a Jewish court, and says at the same time something broader again about justice that Jews have to say about justice, is tapping into an erotic text. We usually do not associate eros with law. In a lecture he gave, Dr. Shmuel Vagoda lightly referenced this piece, and he mentions that, you know, there are other verses in Tehillim that we could have done with, like there in Tanakh, we could have talked about Magle Tzedek, we could have talked about circles of justice. Why are we going to Shira Shirim? And he says one more thing, just to get us started. This is back to Levinas. Perhaps justice is founded on the mastery of passion. The domination exerted at every movement over disorder. This order is precisely the order of the erotic, the realm of the sexual. Justice would be possible only if it triumphs over it, over the grace and charm close to vice. The danger preying upon justice is not the temptation of injustice, flattering the instinct of possession, domination, and aggression. The danger which lurks is vice, which in our Western world belongs to the private sphere, where things are no one's business. What's he saying? He's saying a lot of times it's easy for us, when we're talking about justice, to oppose the concept of justice with the concept of injustice, right? We think about justice versus aggression, justice versus domination. And Levinas says the very use that we're about to see of a verse from the Song of Songs to ground our conception of even how the Jewish court, the Sanhedrin, is set up, is sending a different message. The opposition to justice is not just injustice. The opposition to justice is passion, or being driven by passion, or even being driven by vice. Okay? The opposite of justice on some level is doing something straight from the realm of passion. And we'll see he's going to develop this idea. Let's go back to the Gemara. We're on line 14. Amar Rabbi Acha bar Chanina. Rabbi Acha, son of Chanina, says, here's where the Mishnah gets its ideas from. De Amar Kra, for the verse says in Song of Songs, Sarech Agan Hasahar al Yechsar Hamazik. Now, the literal meaning here, you see why Levinas felt like he needed to apologize for it a little bit. Your belly button is like a goblet that is round. Your belly button is like a goblet that is round. Al yachzar hamazig, the drink within it shall not be lacking. Now, if we're talking about the simple, literal meaning of this text, the beloved is described here as having this beautiful, in those days, right, the flat stomach was not what was desired. It's having this beautiful, healthy, rounded stomach, a belly button atop, a rounded goblet, as it were, where there's nothing, where it's overflowing with goodness. There's no liquid missing and never will be missing. It is a very profound, it is a very strongly erotic image. Now, of course, in our readings of Song of Songs, we all the time read this as not just talking about a man and a woman, but as talking about something else. But here in this text, we have this additional moment, and that's what Levinas is pointing to, what's so striking to him, of saying that this is where we're going to learn how a court of law should be set up. And Levinas says the navel here, the belly button here, sararech here, well, the Talmud says it, sararech zo Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the belly button in the verse. The navel in the verse is the Sanhedrin. Lama nikra, on line 15, Lama nikra shma sararech. Why would it be called that? Shehi yoshevet b'tiburo shel olam, because she exists at the center, as it were, the belly button, let's say, is the center of the body, or at least the center of the torso. She exists at the center of the world. So if it's, and then agan, she megina al kol ha'olam kulo. Here, goblet is read with a play on words, agan, like lehagin, to defend, for it defends over the entire world. Again, that's a Sanhedrin he's describing. Hasahar, shehi doma lesahar, the rounded goblet for the Sanhedrin is like the rounded goblet. Okay, let's look at what Levinas does with this first part of the verse. It's jarring. There's no way to just read this Talmudic text and be automatically satisfied that we understand where this is coming from. Really, where's this coming from? What does it mean to say that the Sanhedrin is the navel of the world? What does it mean to say that this goblet has been reconceived as a defense over the entire world? And where is this? Where is this idea? And why is the roundness then so important? Levinas says this way. This is a way of indicating the centrality of the absolute justice that the Sanhedrin, by definition, metes out, the justice of the Torah. It's a way of indicating the nature of these acts of justice. By speaking of justice in erotic terms, the eroticism of the terms has been overcome, all the while preserving in the meaning of the terms a link to the realm that has been overcome. He's saying, if we're going to say there's almost a battle or a contrast between justice and eros, then co-opting these terms from the realm of eros both enables justice to prevail and highlights that there's a relationship. I'm quoting him again. For a very long time, I've mused about this text. When one is not a specialist in Talmud, one can have musings where others have ideas. I said to myself, how beautiful is this image of the navel of the universe? The creature has been cut off from its source of nourishment, right? What's the navel? The navel is where the umbilical cord comes out, it's the source of nourishment. But the place where justice is pronounced is in the trace of creation. The coming about of justice recalls this heavenly food. The Sanhedrin is the center of the universe. He's really running with this image of the belly button of where the umbilical cord was, that's connected to the source of creation. And I was pleased with this musing. I sometimes still ask myself whether it was only amusing. He thinks it's good, but then he had a jarring moment. A friend brought me back to ordinary reality and to generally held notions and reminded me that the image of the navel of the world is Greek, and that in Aeschylus's The Eumenides, Delphi is called the navel of the world. Huh? Okay, we have to take a step backwards for a moment because the Eumenides is actually going to be important for this reading. And I want to give you a little background information. So Delphi is where the Greeks would worship Apollo. And indeed, in Delphi, at the Temple of Apollo, there was a monument, a rock that was known as the Omphalos, which was the place that the Greeks considered to be the center or the navel, as it were, the belly button of the world. And this image is used by Aeschylus, who is a classic Greek author dramatist, author of tragedies, in his work known as the Eumenides. So the Eumenides is the third installment of a trilogy written by Aeschylus in about 500 BC. So we're talking, and this is one of the things that troubles Levinas, we're talking well before the Mishnah, okay? After the Nevi'im, the Torah Sheba'al Peh is circulating Baal Peh, but before the Mishnah, this concept, this image is there. And what is Aeschylus's The Eumenides? So in the trilogy, which is known as the Oresteia, Aeschylus talks about the house of Atreus and basically what the tragedy of this house. Agamemnon is going to go out to battle. His brother Menelaus's wife, Helen is, that's the Helen of Troy. Agamemnon's going to go out to battle. In order to prevail in battle, he winds up sacrificing his daughter, Iphigenia. So he kills his daughter. When he comes back from the battle, he discovers that his wife, Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, has been having an affair with his first cousin, who's a rival to the throne, potentially a usurper. And Clytemnestra, in fact, kills him, strangles him on his way out of the bathtub on his return home. It's pretty gory stuff. Okay, so we've got Agamemnon, who's killed his daughter, and his wife, Clytemnestra, is killing Agamemnon. It's ugly. You can see how the themes of justice are going to jump out of that kind of a text. But that's not the end of the text. The Eumenides is the third part, right? So the first part is what's going on with Clytemnestra and Agamemnon. The second part is Orestes, the son of Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, avenging his father's death at the hands of his mother by killing his mother. Okay, so we've got murder within the family, number 3. Yikes. And then the third installment of the trilogy, the Eumenides, which is another name for the Greek Furies, but a more positive name, deals with the aftermath of what Orestes did. The Furies, who are 3 earlier gods who seek justice in a very cruel or harsh type of justice, are chasing Orestes to the end, to Apollo's temple at Delphi, and eventually to the Acropolis, to Athena, because they are demanding justice against Orestes for killing his mother, for his act of matricide. Now, Orestes, in his defense, is going to say, Apollo made me do it. It's kind of crazy that we're talking about this much Greek myth here in the middle of discussing Talmud, but this is the background for understanding where Levinas is going to go, and I think it is worthwhile. Orestes says, well, Apollo encouraged me to do it. It wasn't a regular matricide. You have to look at the overall context. There's something else that was going on here. This mother of mine killed my father. And that puts everything in a different light, or it should. Ultimately, Athena convenes a court of Athenians who weigh in on Orestes' sentence. And it's a very interesting dialogue within the Eumenides, because what the Eumenides is dealing with very much is the question of the contrast between strict justice and a justice that looks at things more contextually, more tinged with mercy. There's also an interesting element in that at the end, when Orestes prevails in court, he prevails in this human court, and it's also very interesting that they set up a human court to resolve the issue, that when Orestes prevails at the end, Athena mollifies the fates by turning them into the Eumenides, by bringing them in to somehow be part of the overall culture of Athens. So it's this rollicking, it's this very poetic, very rich with story trilogy that comes to an end with this big musing on justice. And here is what Levinas says happened to him. So again, he's reading this text. He's so struck by the use of this term, savarich, right? Your navel, as describing the Sanhedrin as the navel of the world. And then, and he's having these thoughts about tapping into creation and justice versus eros. And then his friend says, well, you know, Aeschylus, the Greeks, they're talking about their heavenly palace, their heavenly temple. Their concept of a temple is being the navel of the world. This isn't a uniquely Jewish idea. Aeschylus is very ancient. What are you going to do with that? And he's troubled. And here's what Levinas says. It made me reread the Eumenides, and I was moved by it and even saddened. In this work, which one reads in one's youth, a witness to a world that did not know scriptures, I found a greatness, which seemed to suggest to me that everything must have been thought from time immemorial. After reading the Eumenides, one can legitimately ask oneself if there's anything left to read. A struggle opposes Zeus's justice to the justice of Eumenides, justice with forgiveness to justice of unrelenting vengeance. Zeus, and as I see all, is Judaism necessary to the world? Why isn't Aeschylus enough? Aren't all the essential problems broached there in the Eumenides? The Eumenides aren't expelled. Vengeance and justice is not simply dismissed once and for all. The Eumenides express themselves where they get indignant, and at the same time, Athena keeps them and finds a function for them in her city. He's struggling. He says, wow, I'm in the middle of doing this search, this very serious act of soliciting my text, my tradition. I'm comfortable with saying certain things are borrowed. The question is in what spirit they're borrowed, or in what spirit they're transmuted or transformed. And at the same time, I'm troubled. Because I just looked at this other ancient text, says Levinas, and even though Levinas is certainly not subscribing to Avodah Zarah, he thinks the messages of that text about justice are pretty wow. What does he do with that? What can we do with that? How do we move forward? What do we need that's not here? The Sanhedrin, I'm quoting him again, believes itself to be at the navel of the world, but every nation believes it is at the center of the world. The very idea of nation arises each time that a human group thinks it dwells at the navel of the world. Where then is the difference between Delphi and Jerusalem? So now he really has a different mission from where he started. He doesn't just want to solicit the text. He also wants to look at it more carefully to try to understand what the Sanhedrin has to offer that might not be identical to these other texts and these other traditions. Okay. The first point he makes is looking at the word agan, which we read as defending the world. And he says, okay, so maybe the idea here is that the universe is able to be possible because of the justice made in the Sanhedrin. When we say that the Sanhedrin defends the world, then we're saying not just that the Sanhedrin is at the center, but we're saying that that center is somehow going to be enabling life as we know it. But he's going to have to explain that further. Okay. The next part where he gets really deeply into things, if we look at line 21, moving a little further in the Gemara, Bitnech arimat chitim. Your stomach is like a pile of wheat. This is continuing with the theme of saying that the Sanhedrin in its form is drawing from verses from Shir HaShirim. The Talmud says, just as when it comes to a pile of wheat, everyone enjoys it, benefits. Af Sanhedrin, hakol ne'enin mita'amehen. So too the Sanhedrin, everyone benefits from its, now this is an interesting word, ta'amehen, its taste, but he also points out that that also means its reasoning. And as Levinas likes to say, the comparison of the logical reasons for a conclusion to the taste of a hearty meal, right? When you find a new reading of a text, says Levinas, ultimately renewing that sense of what you've read, it tastes good. The rational premises motivating a verdict, he says, are good wheat. The intellect is a life. Okay, that's nice, but still, what are we getting at about justice? And now finally we get to the crux of the Talmudic text. Okay, this is our moment. And it's a moment that you might have seen in a different context, but it introduces what you're probably more familiar with. And it's another phrase from Shir HaShirim. And the phrase is Suga Bashoshanim. Suga is related to the word siyag, or a fence, or cordoning off, or surrounding. Bashoshanim, with lilies. Levinas is going to call them roses. Sometimes they're called roses, but they're really lilies, okay? Fenced off with lilies. She'afilu kisuga shel shoshanim lo yifritzu bahen pratzot. Okay? Even if the Sanhedrin is only, or the members of the Sanhedrin are only fenced off from wrongdoing, let's say, by lilies, they will not make any breaches in that fence. What's he talking about? So here's what Levinas reads this as saying. The members of the Sanhedrin, the ones that before we said were at the center of the universe and defending it, the ones with the universe in their hands, quote, what do they do with their own transgressions, their own vices? We're back to this question of justice and vice. Are they not exposed to temptations, just like the men they're called upon to judge? What makes the difference? Back to this question of what's the difference between the people on the court and the people in the room, which we already said is porous. Are they not exposed to all temptations like the men they're called upon to judge? No. To be a judge in Israel, one must be an exceptional man. Even if only a hedge of roses separates the judge from sin, they will make no breach in it. They master their instincts. So the first thing he says is, Sugaba Shoshanim, this hedge of roses, or we could call it of lilies, is a way in which we're expressing our view of what those who sit on the Sanhedrin must be in order to achieve the high level accolades, which get translated into physical form in terms of the rules in the Mishnah, but are being deeply connected to these beautiful words from Shir Shirim. What level do these people have to be on? He says, yes, they're people like other people, but we are expecting them to handle themselves on another level. And he continues, a hedge of roses is a very thin enclosure. To separate the judges from vice, one not need build a stone wall. It's sufficient to plant a hedge of roses. The enclosure of roses is tempting in itself. The hand spontaneously goes toward the flower. We're going to come back to this. It's a powerful idea. He draws it from the Marsha, which I brought on the next page. What's the image? In other words, when we say that there's a hedge of roses, it's not just that we're saying that this fence, as it were, what's separating someone from sin is something that could be breached or that's delicate or soft. It's tempting. The fence itself is tempting. The hand spontaneously goes toward the flower. What separates us from evil resides seduction. This enclosure is less than an absence of enclosure. When there's nothing between you and evil, it's possible not to bridge the distance. But when there are roses, how is one to resist it? He's saying, wow, this is not, when we're saying the hedge of roses, fences work in different ways, right? He's saying, this isn't just a fence, this is a fence's invitation. They have to be able to look at that invitation. That is how the members of the Sanhedrin are separated from evil. And now he says that this is the key point that he wants to make. Quote, there is no justice if the judges do not have virtue in the flatly moral sense of the term. There cannot be a separation between the private life and the public life of the judge. It is in the most intimate area of his private life, in the secret garden or hell of his soul, that his universal life either blossoms or fades. Soul and mind do not constitute two separate realms. When he's saying that we want a special excellence for the members of the Sanhedrin, that excellence doesn't mean that they're not human. That excellence is in their investment in making moral choices. Their moral mastery over vice is what enables them to seek justice. He completely rejects the idea that someone could be a fine judge and a lousy person. That is not, as he understands it, the Jewish conception of law. Soul and mind do not constitute two separate realms. He has to be seeing the hedge of roses, and he has to be not succumbing within that relationship. It has to be enough. He has to be able to see the temptations and also not bridge that gap to be able to be a judge. Back to the text, line 23, V'hainu damar lehahu mina l'Rav Kahana. And this is connecting, this is a story to a heretic and what he said to Rav Kahana. By the way, in his reading, Levinas, playing with the heretic, he calls him a Parisian. Here's what the Parisian heretic said to Rav Kahana. Amritu nida shari li'echudi bahari gavra. Efshar eish bin aret ve'ena me'avhevet. The heretic says, you said that a man and a woman, who are married, when the wife is in a state of ritual impurity, are nevertheless still allowed to live together in the same room. We don't put a constraint on their being able to be together. How could it be? Could you put flax in fire and it wouldn't burn? Okay, this is true to this day in terms of the laws of family purity in the Jewish tradition. There are times during a month where husband and wife are not allowed to sleep with each other. And yet the halacha is that at that time, the husband and wife still share private space. There's no question of them still having a certain degree of intimacy with each other. For this heretic, this is impossible. For this heretic, it's either you're going to be a total ascetic in isolation, or everything's going to happen. There's no way that they could be together and it wouldn't burn up. And the response that Rav Kahana gives is, HaTorah he'ida aleinu suga b'shoshanim. The Torah here at Shir Shirim gave testimony to us in our ability to do this, to handle this. And that's the same phrase, suga b'shoshanim. Shafilu kisuga b'shoshanim lo yifritzu behen bratzot. It's exactly the same image as we had before talking about the court. This couple, when they're in private and they both maintain the intimacy of being together, but do not breach halacha, are exemplars of this idea of suga b'shoshanim. And here is what Levinas says at this moment in his reading: a hedge, which is the thinnest of thin obstacles, which, as I said earlier, in separating you from sin, also invites you to cross through it. The Torah has identified for us a relation with evil symbolized by a hedge of roses. Judaism conceives the humanity of man as capable of a culture which preserves him from evil by separating him from it by a simple barrier of roses. Now, do you know what I just said? I just said a culture, and that's important because Levinas says what was said before of the judge is now said of the entire Jewish people. Did you notice that in the text? It's a very apt reading. It's not just that the text is saying, oh, that's the same thing. When the text says that it's the same idea, when we're talking about the judge and when we're talking about this husband and wife, what the text is fundamentally saying is that that is Jewish culture. That is Jewish society. That is demanded of all of us. The excellence of the member of the Sanhedrin who can be withstanding sin, or who can be making moral choices, even when the boundary between that person and sin is the thinnest, most seductive boundary imaginable. That idea that man as a whole, man and woman as a whole, a society as a whole can be capable of making that level of moral choice, says Levinas, is at the core of this text. Or, to quote him, morality begins in us and not in institutions, which are not always able to protect it. He's saying this takes us from the institutional level to the individual level. The Sanhedrin was made face after face after face. Each individual in Jewish society is expected to be able to achieve this level of moral excellence. And he says that's something that we're bringing. We're challenging this idea that the heretic had, that you're either automatically going to be withdrawn from the world, some kind of a brick wall, or that you're automatically going to be burning up like flax. The hedge of roses, he says, testifies for us. And then, as a kind of a sad note, he says, if you think that's not true, unfortunately, he says, you look at the Holocaust and you see the way in which so many Jewish people were resilient and maintained their morality in the face of the biggest evil. And now, he wants to say something else, going back to the idea of the Eumenides. What's different between this and the Eumenides? The Eumenides is saying something really important. It's talking about different conceptions of justice. And that's great. It gives us reason to hope that there won't just be strict justice operating in the world, but there will also be some degree of mercy. But he says it's about saving man from despair. It's less concerned about improving him. In our text, the main point is to realize a human being that a simple hedge of roses protects against temptation. Everything in the world that is charming, tempting, seductive, invites us to be vigilant. Let's be careful. No indulgence, be prepared. This is an interesting image of Judaism, in particular when we think about our discussion of the temptation of temptation last week. The temptation of temptation, again, was to try to experience everything without being in it. Levinas is saying something different. He's saying, be in the world with that hedge of roses, but make choices all the time, right? Experiencing everything but not being in it is ultimately not committing to anything. We always have to commit, but we commit by creating a slight distance, and the distance is from our passion. Or he puts it in a slightly different way also. He says, mitzvot, when we think about them, our hedge of roses, which he identifies with mitzvot, it's not about the thorns. Our mitzvot are what keep us or protect us as a hedge of roses, and they're beautiful. The mitzvot are, again, roses. It's a fence, but it's a fence of roses. Back to the text, kind of complete this idea, and then we need to sum up. Reish Lakish Amar, we're in line 27. Reish Lakish Amar, Mehacha. Reish Lakish says, we get the idea of how we can answer the heretic's question about the man and woman being able to withstand temptation when they're married and they can't have relations with each other from somewhere else, from here, from another verse from Shir HaShirim. Kepelach harimon rakatech. Your temple is like it's like the segment of a pomegranate, round and red. Even those who are empty among you, there's a play on rakatech and rake. Even those who are empty among you, Jews, are full of mitzvot like a pomegranate. Listen to Levinas. Reish Lakish gives you an answer to the question which arose in your minds as you listen to the praise of those men protected from temptation by a hedge of roses. How do such men become reality? By being full of mitzvot. In the least practical endeavor, a pause between us and nature through the fulfillment of a mitzvah is a commandment, and we act. Reish Lakish's expression has no other meaning. Unless one wants to believe in some racial excellence or other of Judaism, one must say with Reish Lakish and with the Jewish tradition, for there to be justice, there must be judges resisting temptation. There must be a community which carries out mitzvot right here and now. The power of mitzvot is like the pomegranate full of seeds. The power of mitzvot is presupposed to penetrate the soul. Also presupposed is the history that has made Israel submit to them, and above all, the force of will which at Sinai could decide for the mitzvot. What's Levinas saying? He's saying this whole text is giving us a different conception of justice. Our biggest problem is not justice versus injustice. It's justice that needs to be coming from a space where people are constantly committed to making moral and ethical choices. That starts with the judges, but for Jews, that's supposed to characterize the entire community. We as an entire community are expected to be able to withstand vice or simple succumbing to our passions, the way that one can observe a hedge of roses. And the thing that makes up that hedge, what gives us the power as a community to be able to make those choices, are the mitzvot. The mitzvot that call to us, the mitzvot that define our community, the mitzvot that help us see that things don't just begin with me, they begin with a responsibility. They begin with a weight. They begin with a call. And there's more to say here. He has some wonderful readings of the end of the Gemara, but I think we need to stop here and sort of sum up what we've done, because we've done a lot, and then I'm hoping to leave a little time for questions. Earlier in his talk, he says something which I think helps us see how the different pieces of the puzzle that we've talked about come together. Our existence is not just an awareness of rights, he says. Quote, it's from the beginning an awareness of responsibilities, whether rather than comfortably entering into the world as if into our home, without excusing ourselves, we are from the beginning accused. I think it is a little like that one tries to be Jewish. It is like that one merits being called a human being. What I think is happening here in Levinas is this is really very much part of his system that we started discussing in our first class. We started out by talking about forgiveness, and the nature of forgiveness as Levinas reads it. And it's not just that he talks about the big stakes, and he talks about what it means both in terms of interior and in terms of interpersonal action. What we saw again and again in his first reading and discussion of forgiveness was also his location in interpersonal relationships, of the beginning of what it means to talk about God, to talk about the holy, to talk about the sacred. Transcendence begins in the interpersonal, in my understanding that the other is other, and in my care for how high the stakes are in seeking to work something out with the other. In our second class, we talked about revelation, and what Levinas had us understand from his discussion of revelation is that that conception of the other is not something that happens along the way while I'm going through my merry way of life. It's something that begins from the beginning. It's something that we see already in the Torah. Much as the teachings about forgiveness can refocus us on what our duties are to the other and enable us to do also our best work for ourselves for creating who we are, our understanding of revelation, our acceptance of the Torah threatened above us, har kigigit, that moment over the barrel of threat, that moment where we say that the world cannot exist without the Torah is a move in which the Gemara is showing us that there has to be, before we can talk, before we can learn, before we can explore, before we can do, there has to be a moment where we understand that there is something we need to answer to at the very root of existence. And here, in this piece, this last piece, in this connection to mitzvot, what Levinas is saying is that the thing that keeps us in this system, what makes the Jewish people unique, and not just like the Greeks, but it's a message for all mankind, is that that ethical move requires a series of commitments, of mitzvot. It is through having a hedge of roses, which are not seen as merely a burden, but are also seen as beautiful. It's this double-edged sword. Both sin, getting closer to it, is attractive, and at the same time, the thing that keeps us from it is beautiful. It is creating a culture of people who can understand that there are demands made upon them, moral and ethical demands in particular for Levinas. At any given moment, it is by creating a society, a culture of people who can do that, that there can be ultimately justice in the world. It is mitzvot which give the Jewish people their character. It is mitzvot which enable us to realize in an ongoing fashion as we move through the world this vision of what it is to respect the initial call from Sinai, this vision of what it is to put the ethical first, the other first, and this vision of what it is to realize that it is through those relationships with others that we also realize our relationship with God. Okay, it's quite a lot. I want to open up the floor to, I guess I'll look at the chat and then open up to any questions that you might have. I'm so grateful to you for joining me for this series, and to Tara and Moshe for making this possible. Okay. We have a comment. Levinas's erotics of justice explains why the Gibor, or the hero, is defined as a person at Koveshet Yitzro. Absolutely. The idea of the hero in Pirkei Avot, it says, Ezehu Gibor, who is a hero? Someone who conquers his inclinations. The truth of the matter is that if we had more time, we would have looked at, and I brought in the source sheet if you want to look in your own time, Rav Soloveitchik in Halachic Man spends a lot of time on the Sugah B'Shoshanim. He talks about it as being almost like, like a knight, like this great sacrifice that's made. It's not that the person is able to restrain themselves, and what it is, what halacha does to shape the individual. That's very resonant with what Levinas is saying here, but Levinas has a different overall framework in which he's fitting this idea of what it is to be Koveshet Yitzro. What I think is part of what's so interesting about the way Levinas is framing it is he's saying that this is the grounds for justice. You can't start talking about justice just like some logical puzzle. Someone did something wrong, so they have to be punished, measure for measure, whatever it is. And you can't just talk about justice in terms of justice and mercy. There's no point, he thinks, in talking about justice if there isn't some basic, fundamental, ethical, moral, religious commitment at the basis of what we're doing. Love the taste versus reason. I do too. It's it's the reading that Levinas makes. It's very much there. When we talk about ta'am, the word is the same. We talk about ta'am means taste, and when we talk about rationales for mitzvot, it's the same word, ta'am. And it's a fascinating. It's a beautiful image, and it's very much like Levinas. To take an image that we get used to, that we kind of like, it's a metaphor that almost becomes cliche, and to remind us of how strange and beautiful and intriguing it is, and how much we can learn from it. Thank you, Mr. Walken. Shoshanim denotes the inhabitants of Shushan. You said Kimu V'Kiblu. Oh, yafeh. Restricted glasses. Very, very clever. So we were talking last time, remember, about Shushan as being a particular stage of the Jew from within that moment in history, understanding what it is to have this initial death, this initial call. And perhaps it's not a coincidence that Shoshanim sounds like Shushan. Thank you very much. Would Levinas be considered a non-Zionist? So that's a huge question. And no, I would not consider Levinas to be a non-Zionist, but it's a whole other topic. I was tempted. I used the word temptation because it's on my mind with Levinas. There's one fantastic reading he has about the spies. He has a very interesting reading. He's how do I put this? We talked last time a little bit about his how much the Holocaust is there in the background of his thought, and the establishment of the state of Israel is something he's thinking about all the time. He's grappling with what it means. The same questions, right? Translating the Talmud into Greek. What is this? What is this country? How is this country like any country? How is it not like any country? How does it realize when we're talking about Eretz Yisrael, what does it mean, and how does it so you just read it. Yeah. So we're not going to be able to really touch on it now, but maybe we'll do a follow-up at some point, because I think it's very, very worthwhile. Jeff Schwartz, people who don't commit to and have experience keeping mitzvah can't be expected to act justly. Is he saying that? So I don't think he's saying that they can't be expected to act justly. I think he's saying that there's a legacy, or there's a Jewish idea here, saying we could read it in one of two ways, the text. We could say, we're just kind of like some sort of racist. We think Jews are inherently special. Or we could say that there's something that we're doing here that's putting us in a position to be able to relate in a unique way to justice. He likes the second option. And what I think he's saying is that mitzvot are a uniquely effective way to enable people to make the moral commitments that are the base rock of justice. And that winds up sending a message to the world that a culture of moral restraint and of justice is possible. So it's perhaps possible that people could be acting justly, but we'd be back to the idea of without mitzvot, we're just relying on there being an exceptional individual, right? This person is just really an extraordinary person. This person has uniquely well-developed attributes. What Levinas is saying is unique about the system of mitzvot is that if it's working well, we're creating an entire nation of moral excellence as a bedrock of justice. And that, he thinks, is something that mitzvot are uniquely able to do. It's sort of like, mitzvot are sort of like a course correction, or they're a basic fundamental way of setting up the society. And it would be a huge advantage to creating this, or to saying that this is a priority for us, right? When they're so basic to us, and it's saying that this is a priority of how we're relating to the world. So it doesn't mean it's impossible for other people, but it's going to be more subject to the winds, or subject to unique individuals' positive traits or negative traits, or something like that. Mitzvot, if we can really follow them, he thinks puts them more objectively, gives us a framework. I should add, by the way, and this is important, Levinas, I don't know the details of his observance. He's described in some places as being Masorti, but that can mean a lot of different things. My understanding is that he kept a lot of mitzvot, but I don't know if he would fit everyone's definition of to every jot and tittle of Orthodox. So I also don't think that that's the point he's making. I think he's saying something else. He's saying that there's a system here. There's a system here that is responding to revelation and creating, God willing, a type of society with a special message about justice for the world. Thank you, Zmira. This has been a very special experience for me. As you can tell, I love this material. It was a wonderful excuse for me to get back into it, and really it's been a pleasure learning with you. Maybe we'll find a way to get into the thank you. Maybe we'll find a way to get into some more in the future, but I do hope that you'll seek out some Levinas, and not only just seeking out Levinas. I hope that the ideas that he's raising and some of the interesting the ways in which he's reading, the ways in which he doesn't shy away from things that seem strange, but really again and again headfirst leans into them and finds meaning in what might first be jarring. I hope that can help inform, as Levinas, I think in the best Levinasian way. I hope that can help inform the general, his broader philosophy, can help inform not just how we read texts, but how we interact with each other in the world and serve God. So thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much, Leah, for hosting, and for Torah in Motion for everything.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Laurie, for the most amazing series and phenomenal class today. Wishing everyone all the best.
Thank you.